We at the Milken Institute do women's programming around the world at all the various conferences that we convene. And I thought I'd take a moment and just explain why this issue, for me, is a personal one. So 27 years ago, 1990, I was in graduate school, and I read an article, an HBR piece, which was the seminal work on women in the workforce called Ways Women Lead by Judy Rosner. And I was looking for a thesis, and I thought, oh, that's kind of good, I'll do that. And so I started to interview senior women in financial services, which is where I was beginning my career. And at the time, most of the women who were in relatively senior positions that I met were dressed like men. So boxy suits, ties often, if you remember the floppy ties, using like saltier language than they might otherwise. And the premise of the article was that there was going to be a sea change, and that the way that the anachronistic way of leading, which was a command and control environment, which was very male-dominated, and actually even in a bank, you're all officers, right? There's a military complex language that informs the way the organization was structured, but that this new wave of women was coming along, and that was not the way that they were going to lead. So I thought, okay, so as I'm writing this, I became the expert in women in the workforce after that, of course, and I was at a reorganization meeting at the bank where they were going through some integration of businesses that had been acquired, and I was a relatively junior person, and on the screen, the person put up an org chart, and in each of the boxes, it just said the first letter and the last name, so J. Smith, M. Jones, etc. So being filled with this knowledge about gender, I raised my hand and I said, can you walk me through, of that list, how many of them are women? And the answer was that it was a little getting too late in the program and that we would address that later. So afterwards, in a meeting not unlike this, where people started to gather for cocktails, the HR person came over to me and chastised me and said, they don't appreciate being called out on something that the senior management was not expecting to hear. And I thought, if I'm ever in a position that I can change that dynamic in the workplace, I'm going to. And then many years later, when I was the CEO of the private bank at Citi, I decided that we were going to focus on diversity as an initiative. And not because it was a nice thing to do, but because there was a business rationale to do so. All of this money that was being transferred to women, all of the same-sex couples that had money that we had never embraced before in a way to manage them from a private banking perspective. So it became very noted to me that the language we use is important. And at that time, 27 years ago, while we all talk about these issues today, it really was not very prevalent at all. And in fact, if it were, it was in the HR department as something that HR was going to focus on, and it wasn't part of the business of the organization. So it's important to change the language. At that time, there was this notion of tolerance. We were going to tolerate people who were different than the norm. Now, who wants to be tolerated? So then it changed to, no, now we're going to be diverse, right? Because there's diverse communities and we're going to include them. And now it's actually moved into inclusion, right? So if you think of that trajectory over those 3 decades or so, it really has become much more relevant to the people who you have both in your employ and the clients that you're hoping to get as clients. You have to expect people to show up. And a perfect example of that is in the United States, the Senate building did not have a ladies' room until 1992. And why is that? Well, they weren't expecting any women to come. And even more appalling, in the House, it wasn't until 2011 that John Boehner ordered there to be a ladies' room. So people who were elected to Congress had to schlep across the building to find a ladies' room. I think one of the more pertinent comments I've ever heard was delivered in 1993 by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And she said, upon President Clinton nominating her for the bench, that the announcement the president just made marks the end of days when women appear in the senior-most places one at a time. And I think too often we focus on that barrier-breaking, glass ceiling shattering one person, but really it's the second person and the third person that makes it the norm. And when you create normative behaviors, you can stop talking about gender as an issue. So while I'm thrilled that we have a women's session here, I'm waiting for the day that we don't need one. And I couldn't have said to Laura, hey, can we have a man session? Can we have a session about men? And the reason for that is because the cultural norm, the person you're expecting to show up, tends to be a man. And that's why language is so critical to changing the perceptions and changing what we're trying to do. And when we talk about it, and we talk about how we talk to our children about it, and we think we're going to tell our daughters that you can be anything you want to be, and you can be educated, and you can participate in an economy, maybe in a different way than your grandmother or great-grandmother did. But I often think the better conversation is with our sons, because teaching them that it's okay to have everyone be equal, to work for a woman, to have a woman as a colleague, to have people of different genders, different perceptions in the workplace and part of your customer base, is going to really be the way we change society. So it's both our daughters and our sons. So I wanted to make this a more participative outing here, and we have a lot of great minds in the room, and you've heard from wonderful speakers all day today. So I thought we would use these remaining minutes that we have to task you with joining the others at your table and developing a couple of answers to some questions that then we will gather at the Milken Institute and then shoot back to you as a feedback loop so you can participate in what happened today. So the first question, if we could put them on the board, please. Okay, what are the 3 takeaways that you have? And they'll be varied from your different perceptions, but we want to gather all of that so that it can inform our programming going forward. And then the second one really speaks to this notion of perception. And I think you have to name a problem and not pretend it's not there in order to fix it. If I don't know what the problem is, I can't help you solve it. But if we talk about it, then we can creatively think about some solutions. So what are the perceptions that you might face in the workplace that creates challenges for you as a woman? So are there things that people think, does your gender inform anything about your workplace that might be different? And I'll give you an example. When my children were smaller, if I left the office to go to a baseball practice or a dance recital, like people would think like, oh, he's such a great dad. Isn't that nice? He's participating. But if women in the office did it, I would often notice that, and other women were the ones talking about it often, that was not good. And that people tended to suppress that part of themselves in order to think they're more fully participating in the workplace. But if a guy did it, then it was kind of like a check mark of positive. So the notion there, Stacy, is that, are there certain perceptions that still exist that you think you need to navigate differently than maybe a male in the same office? So why don't we take 10 or 15 minutes, go over that with your table mates, and then there's a way through the app that you can let us know what those are.